The alarm on my console screamed before I even understood what it meant. Red light filled the observation deck of the Council cruiser Halvorn, and every officer around me froze for half a second, which in our world was an eternity. I am Kestrel Van, Senior Analyst of the Xeno Assessment Corps, and I was standing in the vote chamber the day the Council decided to erase a species that would soon make all of us wish we had never heard its name. The chamber was silent, except for the low hum of the translation field. Above us floated the image of a small blue planet, spinning quietly, unaware that thousands of beings from a dozen worlds were staring at it like a piece of meat on a table. The planet was called Earth. Its people called themselves humans. I had read the reports twice before the vote. I had flagged them. I had begged my superiors to look closer. Nobody listened. The official reason for the invasion was resources. Earth sat on rare minerals that 3 great trade houses wanted, and the Council loved nothing more than a clean, profitable expansion. But there was a second reason buried under the paperwork, one that made my hands shake every time I reread it. Behavioral anomaly. That was the term the analysts used. It meant something simple and terrifying. Humans did not know how to stop fighting. Every species the Council had ever encountered understood limits. When the cost of war became too great, they surrendered. It was logical. It was efficient. It was the natural order of things. Humans broke that pattern completely. Their own historical records, which our scout drones had quietly gathered for decades, showed wars fought long after any reasonable calculation said they should have ended. Wars fought over ideas, over pride, over nothing at all that a rational mind could measure. Humans did not fight to win in the way we understood winning. They fought until the fighting itself stopped being possible. I raised my hand during the assessment briefing and asked a simple question. If a species has never in its recorded history accepted defeat as a permanent condition, why do we assume they will accept ours? The chief strategist, an older council officer named Draeth Solon, waved my question away like smoke. He said humans had spears and metal boxes with wheels. He said their strongest weapons could not scratch the hull of a single council frigate. He said the vote was a formality. He was wrong. But on that day, nobody wanted to hear it. The vote passed with an embarrassing majority. 700 delegates raised their hands, eager for new territory, eager for the minerals beneath the soil of a planet none of them had ever set foot on. I did not raise my hand. It did not matter. The Council does not need unanimous agreement, only enough to move forward, and forward it moved with terrifying speed. Within a single lunar cycle, 3 fleets were assembled. I was assigned to the flagship Meridian Wake as an observer, a role that sounded harmless, but meant I would witness everything up close, record everything, and report back on how efficiently the operation unfolded. Efficient was the word everyone used. I would come to hate that word. The night before we entered the Sol system, I stood on the observation deck beside a young tactical officer named Corin Bess. He was excited in the way young officers often are before their first campaign, full of talk about glory and quick victory. He asked me why I looked so uneasy. I told him the truth. I told him I had read the Human Wars. I told him about a conflict on their world called the Second Great War, where entire cities were reduced to ash, and the losing side still refused to stop until there was nothing left to lose. I told him about smaller human conflicts too, wars fought in jungles and deserts against enemies with far greater weapons, wars where the technologically inferior side won simply by refusing every offer to end things peacefully. Corin laughed. He said humans had no ships, no energy weapons, nothing that could reach us in orbit. He said this would be over in a week. I wanted to believe him. I really did. We arrived above Earth on a bright morning by their local calendar, though from orbit it made no difference to us. The fleet fanned out in the standard council formation, 300 vessels arranged in perfect geometric harmony, cameras recording every angle for the historical archive. This was meant to be a triumph, a lesson taught to a primitive world about the order of the greater galaxy. Our first transmission went out in every major human language, translated by algorithms that had studied their broadcasts for years. The message was simple. Surrender your planet's resources, and your species will be permitted to continue existing under Council administration. Resist, and the consequences will be swift. For 3 full hours, there was no response at all. Then, on every screen across the fleet, a single video began to play. It had been recorded decades earlier, pulled from human television archives, and somehow broadcast back at us on every frequency we were using. It showed a stadium full of humans watching some kind of sporting contest, all of them cheering, laughing, utterly unafraid. The message accompanying it was short. It was not spoken by any official leader. It came from a single unnamed voice, and it said only this: "We have seen worse mornings than this one. Come down and find out." I remember the silence on the bridge after that message played. Nobody laughed. Nobody dismissed it the way they had dismissed my reports. For the first time since the vote, I saw genuine uncertainty on the faces of officers who had spent their whole careers believing conquest was simple arithmetic. Admiral Threl Kion, commander of the invasion fleet, ordered the first wave forward anyway. Doctrine called for a decapitation strike, a coordinated assault on major population centers and command structures designed to remove leadership and communication before any organized resistance could form. It was a strategy that had worked flawlessly on 11 other worlds. 11 surrenders, all quick, all clean. I watched from the Meridian Wake as our strike craft descended toward the coordinates marked for what our intelligence called the primary command center of the strongest human nation. Our sensors expected minimal resistance. Human air defense, according to every report, was decades behind our own technology. The first wave never returned. It was not destroyed by some hidden superweapon. That would have almost been comforting, something we could understand and calculate against. Instead, our ships simply stopped transmitting, all of them at once, as if some invisible hand had reached up and closed a fist around them. Admiral Kion demanded answers from his scouts. It took another 2 hours before a single surviving pilot managed to send a garbled, static-filled message back to the fleet. I still remember his voice, shaking in a way I had never heard from a council pilot before. He said the humans had known we were coming for a long time, long before we arrived. He said their cities were empty, their leadership scattered into hidden bunkers built decades earlier for exactly this kind of moment, and that what we thought was their command structure was nothing but an elaborate decoy. He said something had come up from the ground itself, swarms of small aircraft moving faster than our sensors expected, using methods our systems could not properly track because they were simple, almost primitive by our standards, yet impossible to predict, because nothing in our doctrine accounted for an enemy who had prepared for total war as if it were an ordinary Tuesday. Admiral Kion ordered a full analysis. I was part of the team assigned to review the data, and what I found chilled me more than anything in the original reports I had written. Humans were not just resisting. They were doing so with a calm, methodical confidence that suggested this was not new to them. Every failed system, every jammed communication, every unexpected maneuver, all of it pointed toward a species that had spent its entire history preparing for exactly this kind of moment, even though they had never once faced an enemy from beyond their own world. I began to understand something that night, standing alone in the analysis bay while the rest of the fleet debated strategy above me. We had not encountered a weak, primitive world ripe for easy conquest. We had woken up a species built by millions of years of relentless competition, one that had turned every hardship, every war, every disaster into another lesson in survival. And now, for the first time in their history, they finally had an enemy that was not one of their own. I did not sleep that night. Neither, I suspect, did anyone else on that fleet who had bothered to actually read the history we brought with us. Admiral Kion still believed the setback was temporary, a fluke born of clever but ultimately doomed guerrilla tactics. He ordered the second wave to prepare for planetary descent within the day. I wanted to warn him properly this time, to stand before the full command staff and lay out everything I had found, but before I could request that meeting, a new transmission arrived from the surface, this one different from the first. It was not a broadcast pulled from old archives. It was live, recorded from somewhere in the ruins of what had once been a human city, and the voice speaking was calm, almost gentle, in a way that somehow made it more unsettling than any threat could have been. The voice belonged to a woman. She introduced herself simply as Grace. She said she was not a soldier, not a leader, just someone who had lost her home in our first strike and wanted us to understand something before we sent down our second wave. She said humans had spent 10,000 years fighting each other, inventing new ways to survive impossible odds, refusing every single time history told them to give up. She said we had made a mistake choosing violence as our first approach, not because it would fail immediately, but because it would teach her people exactly how we thought, exactly how we moved, exactly what we valued, and that every lesson we gave them would come back to us multiplied. Then the transmission ended, and the silence that followed felt heavier than any explosion. I stood on the observation deck long after the meeting had scattered, staring down at that small blue world, watching the lights of human cities flicker in patterns our sensors could not fully explain. Something had changed in the way I understood the conflict ahead of us. This was not going to be a war of conquest. This was going to be a war humanity had been quietly training for since the very first time one of their ancestors picked up a sharpened stone against another. And we had just given them a reason to remember every lesson they had ever learned. The second wave launched at dawn by the human clock, and this time Admiral Kion took no chances. He deployed nearly half the fleet's ground forces at once, spreading them across 6 continents instead of concentrating on a single target. His reasoning was simple. If humans had somehow prepared for a strike on one location, they could not possibly prepare for 6 simultaneous ones. It was sound council logic. It had worked on every world before this one. I rode down with the support division assigned to observe the landing near a coastal human city, tasked with recording the operation for the historical archive. My hands trembled slightly as our shuttle broke through the atmosphere, not from fear of the descent itself, but from the memory of that woman's voice still echoing in my mind. Every lesson we teach them will come back to us multiplied. The landing zone looked peaceful when we touched down. Rolling green hills, a scattering of homes, no visible military presence at all. Our ground commander, a broad-shouldered officer named Velik Thorn, ordered the troops forward in standard formation, confident that resistance here would be minimal given the rural setting. We walked for nearly 20 minutes without incident. I remember thinking, foolishly, that perhaps the first wave had simply been unlucky, a strange convergence of bad circumstances rather than a sign of anything larger. Then the ground itself seemed to come alive. It began with small explosions, not powerful enough to destroy our armor, but precisely placed to separate our formation into smaller, more manageable groups. I later learned humans called these devices improvised charges, built from farming equipment and simple chemicals, things so basic our sensors had not even flagged them as threats. Within moments, our neat formation had been broken into 6 isolated pockets, each cut off from the others by fallen trees, collapsed bridges, and clever use of the terrain itself. Then came the ambush. I did not see the attackers clearly at first. They moved through the tall grass and tree lines with a discipline that seemed impossible for a species we had assessed as barely past industrial technology. Their weapons fired conventional projectiles, nothing exotic, nothing our shields should have struggled against in theory. But they did not fire in the open, predictable patterns our combat simulations expected. They fired, moved, and vanished, before we could properly locate them, using cover and angles that our tactical algorithms had never been trained to anticipate, because our algorithms had been built by species that fought in straight lines and clear formations, believing that was simply how war worked. I watched 3 of our soldiers fall within the first minute, their shields overwhelmed not by superior firepower, but by concentrated fire from angles our formation never should have exposed. Commander Thorn ordered a retreat to higher ground, a reasonable tactical decision, except the humans had clearly expected exactly that and had already prepared positions there as well. It was during this chaos that I witnessed something that would stay with me long after that day ended. A small group of our soldiers, separated from the main formation, found themselves cornered near a collapsed structure. A young human man approached them alone, hands raised, speaking calmly, in accented council trade language he must have learned from our own broadcasts. He said he wished to discuss terms for his position. Our soldiers, trained under council protocol to accept any reasonable offer of peaceful resolution, lowered their weapons slightly and began the standard negotiation sequence. It was a trick. The moment their guard dropped, hidden allies emerged from positions we had completely missed, and the encounter ended with our soldiers captured rather than the reverse. I later heard, through fleet intelligence gathered over the following weeks, that this tactic repeated itself again and again across different landing zones. Fake surrenders, fake retreats, fake negotiations, each one exploiting our own doctrine of honorable engagement against us. Humans had studied exactly how we expected war to be conducted, and they used our own rules as tools against us. By nightfall, our forces had suffered losses far beyond anything in our projections. Admiral Kion ordered a full withdrawal of ground troops to reassess, a decision that surely felt humiliating for a fleet that had expected total victory within days. I spent that evening reviewing recovered communication logs from the soldiers who had survived, and one detail stood out to me more than any tactical failure. Several soldiers reported hearing humans laughing during the fighting, talking casually among themselves about ordinary things, sharing food, even singing softly between exchanges of gunfire. Our threat assessment systems flagged this behavior as a malfunction, unable to categorize combatants who treated mortal danger with such strange calm. I did not believe it was a malfunction. I believed it was something far more unsettling. These people were not afraid because danger like this was familiar to them. They had built entire cultures around enduring hardship and finding ways to keep living through it. 2 days after the failed ground assault, the Council attempted a different approach. Rather than direct confrontation, Admiral Kion ordered a demonstration of force, a controlled strike on an uninhabited region meant to showcase the raw power of our orbital weapons without unnecessary loss of human life. The idea was to frighten the population into pressuring their leadership towards surrender, a tactic that had worked on several previous worlds where public fear outweighed political resolve. The strike itself proceeded exactly as planned. A section of uninhabited desert was reduced to scorched glass, visible from orbit, an unmistakable message of what we were capable of doing to populated areas if resistance continued. The response came less than an hour later, broadcast across every frequency we monitored. It was not fear. It was not panic. It was a single video showing ordinary humans standing together in a public square, calmly discussing the strike, as though reviewing weather reports rather than a demonstration of planetary-scale destruction. A man near the front of the crowd addressed our fleet directly, his voice steady, almost bored. He said his grandparents had lived through worse than a patch of empty desert being burned. He said threats meant to frighten only worked on people who believed the future was guaranteed to be peaceful, and humanity had never once believed that. He said if we wanted a demonstration that actually mattered to them, we would need to try something they had not already survived at least twice before in their own history. I remember Admiral Kion's expression when that message played across the command deck. It was the first time I saw genuine doubt cross his face, the first crack in the absolute confidence that had defined the entire operation from its earliest planning stages. Over the following days, resistance only grew more sophisticated. Humans began using our own recovered equipment against us, adapting alien technology with a speed our engineers found almost impossible to believe. Downed shuttles were stripped for parts within hours. Captured weapons were reverse-engineered into modified versions suited for human hands, sometimes crude, sometimes surprisingly elegant, always effective in ways our original designs never intended. I was assigned to interview several soldiers recovering from encounters on the surface, hoping to gather psychological data that might help our command staff understand what we were truly facing. One young soldier named Oren, barely out of training, described an encounter with a small unit of human resistance fighters that had left him deeply shaken, though physically unharmed. He said they had been trapped in a defensive position for nearly 6 hours, expecting reinforcements that never arrived due to communication jamming. During that time, the The humans surrounding them made no attempt to rush the position or force a costly confrontation. Instead, they waited, calmly, occasionally calling out simple questions in broken council trade language, almost as if studying their enemy rather than trying to destroy them. When reinforcements finally broke through, the human fighters had already vanished into the surrounding terrain, leaving behind nothing but a single handwritten note in a language our translators struggled to properly interpret, though the tone conveyed something unmistakably close to amusement. I began compiling these reports into a single document, hoping to present a unified picture to Admiral Kion before more soldiers were lost following outdated assumptions. But before I could deliver my findings, an emergency briefing was called following the most troubling incident of the campaign so far. A small human team had somehow infiltrated one of our orbital supply stations, a facility we considered completely secure, given the technological gap between our defenses and anything humanity could theoretically produce. The details of exactly how they managed this remained unclear for weeks afterward, though later investigation suggested they had used a combination of stolen access codes, disguised shuttles, and an almost impossible level of patience, waiting for the exact right moment across nearly 2 full days of careful observation before making their move. The station was not destroyed in the traditional sense. Instead, its primary systems were quietly disabled, rendered useless without a single alarm triggering until it was far too late to respond. When the problem was finally discovered, we lost access to critical supply lines feeding our forward operating bases, a setback that would prove costly in the difficult weeks ahead. Admiral Kion called the emergency briefing not to discuss strategy this time, but to ask a single, simple question of every analyst present. How was this possible? How could a species so far behind us, in every measurable category, consistently outmaneuver forces with vastly superior technology, coordination, and firepower? I stood before the command staff that evening, finally given the opportunity I had wanted since before the invasion even began. I told them what I had come to understand through every report, every recording, every strange, unsettling detail gathered over the preceding days. This was not a species fighting an unfamiliar kind of war. This was a species that had spent its entire recorded history training for exactly this moment, refining strategies of deception, patience, and endurance against countless enemies of their own kind, long before we ever arrived to give them a new one. I told them that every tactic we considered clever or unpredictable was, to humans, simply ordinary. Every ambush, every disabled station, every calm response to overwhelming force was not improvisation born of desperation. It was doctrine, passed down through generations of conflict we had never bothered to properly study before deciding their world was worth taking. Admiral Kion listened in silence for a long while after I finished speaking. When he finally responded, his voice carried none of the confidence from our arrival in this system. He asked me one final question before dismissing the briefing. If everything I said was true, what exactly would it take to make humanity surrender? I did not have an answer for him that night. I would come to have one soon enough, though it was not the answer any of us wanted to hear. 3 weeks into the campaign, the Council fleet held a war council of its own, though by that point, the word victory had quietly disappeared from every briefing document. I sat near the back of the chamber aboard the Meridian Wake, watching officers who had once spoken with total confidence now struggling to explain simple losses in language that did not sound like an admission of failure. Admiral Kion asked for a full review of Earth's historical record, something that should have been done long before the vote was ever called. I was given access to archives that had sat untouched in Council storage for years, gathered by scout probes that had observed the planet quietly from a distance for nearly a century before anyone decided the world was worth invading. What I found reshaped everything I thought I understood about the species we were fighting. Humans had never known a single generation of true, lasting peace across their entire recorded history. Every era of their civilization carried some form of conflict, whether between nations, ideologies, or simply neighboring communities competing for land and resources. And yet through every one of these conflicts, a pattern repeated itself endlessly. When faced with an enemy that seemed impossible to defeat through conventional means, humans did not retreat into despair. They adapted. They found new tools, new tactics, new ways of thinking that turned apparent weakness into unexpected strength. I studied records of conflicts fought with primitive weapons against forces holding overwhelming technological superiority, and in case after case, the technologically weaker side had found ways to win, not through matching firepower, but through patience, terrain knowledge, and a willingness to endure hardship that their stronger opponents simply could not match. I read about resistance movements that continued fighting long after their cause seemed hopeless by any rational measure, refusing to accept defeat even when every calculation said they should. More unsettling still were the smaller details, the ones that never made it into official military histories, but that shaped how humans approached conflict on every level. Children in many human cultures grew up playing games that simulated combat and strategy, learning lessons about tactics and teamwork before they ever understood the seriousness of real war. Ordinary tools, meant for farming or construction, had been repurposed as weapons throughout their history, whenever necessity demanded it. A habit so deeply ingrained that our own intelligence had failed to recognize tractors and chemical fertilizers as potential threats simply because our species had never needed to think that way. I brought these findings to the War Council, laying out a picture of a species whose entire cultural identity had been shaped by struggle. Humans did not fear difficult odds the way other species did, because difficult odds were simply the normal condition of their existence. Every war, every disaster, every hardship had been absorbed into their collective memory as another lesson survived, another story passed down to the next generation as proof that giving up was never truly necessary, no matter how impossible the situation appeared. The deeper problem, and the one that troubled me most as an analyst, was that the Council's entire approach to warfare rested on assumptions that simply did not apply here. Our doctrine assumed that overwhelming force eventually broke the will of any opponent. It assumed that civilian populations, once frightened sufficiently, would pressure their leadership toward peaceful resolution. It assumed that once battlefield losses reached a certain threshold, rational calculation would demand surrender as the only sensible path forward. Humans operated by none of these rules. Our attempts at demonstrations of force had been met with calm indifference rather than fear. Our efforts to negotiate honorable terms of engagement had been exploited rather than respected. Our assumption that battlefield losses would eventually break their resolve had, if anything, produced the opposite effect, hardening their resistance rather than weakening it. I remember a particular exchange during that War Council that captured the growing unease among the command staff. A younger officer named Farron Voss, who had transferred in from a diplomatic division rather than a combat one, asked a question that nobody wanted to answer directly. He asked what would happen if humanity simply refused to ever formally surrender, regardless of how the conflict eventually concluded. Admiral Kion did not have an answer. Nobody in that chamber did. Meanwhile, on the surface, the situation continued to deteriorate for our forces in ways that grew steadily more strange and unsettling. Reports began arriving of small human communities that had apparently gone completely dark to our sensors, not through destruction, but through some deliberate effort to hide themselves entirely from detection. When our forces investigated one such location, they found only evidence that the population had relocated recently, leaving behind carefully prepared defensive positions clearly meant for whoever might follow. In another incident, an entire company of our soldiers occupying what they believed was an abandoned human settlement discovered, after nearly 2 full days, that they had been under constant quiet observation the entire time. The humans watching them had made no aggressive moves, content simply to gather information about troop numbers, equipment, and patrol patterns before withdrawing, without ever engaging directly. When our forces finally realized what had happened, all they found was a single message carved into the wall of an abandoned building, written in careful council trade script. It read simply, "We know how you move now." I began to understand, reading report after report like these, that humanity was not merely resisting our invasion. They were studying us with the same careful patience they had once used to study every enemy in their own long history of conflict. Every encounter, successful or not, was providing them with new information, new patterns to exploit, new weaknesses to target in future engagements. This realization terrified me more than any single battle could have. An enemy who fought back with desperate energy would eventually exhaust themselves. An enemy who fought back through careful, patient study of everything we did would only grow stronger with every encounter, learning faster than we could adapt in response. The Council's rules of engagement, built over centuries of relatively predictable conflicts with other species, simply had no answer for this kind of enemy. Our protocols called for clear communication of terms, respect for declared surrenders, and proportional response, calibrated to avoid unnecessary escalation. Humans treated every one of these protocols as an opportunity, rather than a courtesy. Declared surrenders became traps. Communication channels became sources of intelligence to exploit. Proportional responses were met with wildly disproportionate creativity, as though our restraint was simply another weakness to be studied and turned against us. I recall reviewing a particularly troubling incident involving a captured human soldier, one of the few taken alive during the early stages of the campaign. Our interrogation specialists, following standard council protocol, expected either defiant resistance or eventual cooperation once psychological pressure reached sufficient levels. The soldier, a young man who gave his name simply as Daniel, did neither. He answered every question calmly, sometimes even helpfully, providing information that seemed genuine but ultimately useless for any meaningful tactical advantage. When asked why he cooperated so readily, he explained, almost cheerfully, that he had been trained specifically for this kind of situation, taught from an early age that captivity was simply another circumstance to endure rather than fear. He said his people had a long tradition of soldiers surviving captivity through patience and calm cooperation, waiting quietly for opportunities that inevitably arose given enough time. 3 days after that interrogation concluded, Daniel escaped custody using a method our security specialists still could not fully explain months later, vanishing from a supposedly secure facility without triggering a single alarm. I brought this incident, along with dozens of others like it, into a final comprehensive report that I delivered personally to Admiral Kion before the campaign's most difficult turning point. I told him plainly that we were not fighting a primitive species that happened to resist unexpectedly well. We were fighting a species whose entire civilization had been built, generation after generation, into the perfect adversary for exactly this kind of extended, patient, asymmetric conflict. I told him that humanity's history contained no example of a war ending simply because one side grew tired of fighting. Every conflict in their record ended, either through complete resolution of the underlying dispute or through the total exhaustion of one side's capacity to continue, never through a simple loss of will. And I told him, as gently as I could manage, that our fleet, however powerful, was not prepared for a war of that kind. Admiral Kion listened to my full report in complete silence, longer than any silence I had witnessed from him since our arrival in this system. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight I had not heard from him before, the sound of a commander beginning to understand that the war he had been sent to fight was not the war actually unfolding beneath his fleet. He asked me what I believed would happen if we continued the campaign at its current pace, using our current strategies, without fundamentally changing our approach to this conflict. I told him the truth, though it cost me something to say it aloud in that chamber, surrounded by officers who had once been so certain of easy victory. I told him we would lose, not through a single decisive battle, but slowly, piece by piece, ship by ship, until the fleet that had arrived with such overwhelming confidence simply had nothing left to continue the fight with. And worse, I told him, every day we remained in this system, humanity would continue learning, continue adapting, continue turning our own tactics against us with growing precision. Admiral Kion dismissed the War Council shortly after that exchange, and I remember watching him remain alone in the chamber long after everyone else had departed, staring at the small blue planet still turning quietly below us, no longer looking at it the way a conqueror looks at a conquest, but the way a person looks at something they have badly, perhaps fatally, misjudged. The turning point came exactly 1 month after our arrival in the Sol system, and it began with the loss of something the Council fleet had considered completely untouchable. Our forward orbital anchor, a massive structure serving as the central hub for all fleet operations across the system, held position nearly 40,000 kilometers above the planet's surface, protected by layers of defensive systems that had never once failed in any previous Council campaign. I was aboard the anchor that day, having been summoned to deliver an updated assessment directly to the senior staff stationed there. It was meant to be a routine briefing, another addition to the growing pile of warnings nobody seemed able to fully act upon in time. The attack, when it came, did not announce itself with any of the signatures our detection systems were built to recognize. There were no large ships approaching, no massed formations of shuttles, nothing that matched the profile of a conventional assault. Instead, 3 small vessels, barely larger than personal transports, approached the anchor using a docking authorization sequence that our systems verified as legitimate. I later learned, through the painstaking investigation that followed, exactly how this had been accomplished. Weeks earlier, during the chaos of ground operations, a small human team had captured a Council supply officer along with his complete authorization credentials. Rather than using this information immediately, they had waited, patiently gathering additional access codes and operational patterns over nearly 3 full weeks before making their move. This was not the desperate improvisation of a cornered species. This was a deliberate, carefully constructed plan, executed with a level of patience I genuinely did not believe our own forces could have managed under similar circumstances. By the time our security systems recognized something was wrong, it was already far too late. The 3 vessels had docked successfully, deployed a small team directly into the anchor's primary systems core, and began disabling critical infrastructure with a precision that suggested detailed prior knowledge of our station's exact layout, information that could only have come from captured personnel or salvaged technical documents. I was 3 levels away when the alarms finally triggered, and the chaos that followed remains, to this day, the clearest memory I carry from the entire campaign. Emergency bulkheads sealed automatically throughout the station, trapping various groups of personnel in isolated sections. Communication systems flickered in and out as the human team methodically worked through the station's core infrastructure. And through it all, I heard something that I will never fully forget. A calm human voice broadcasting over our own internal communication channels, speaking directly to every isolated group of Council personnel still trapped within the station. The voice, which I later learned belonged to a woman named Clara, did not threaten us. She did not demand our surrender or gloat over what her team had accomplished. Instead, she calmly explained that emergency evacuation shuttles had been left intact and accessible, that her team had no interest in unnecessary loss of life, and that we had exactly 40 minutes to evacuate before the station's primary systems failed completely. I remember the confusion this caused among the senior staff sheltering with me. Some officers insisted this was clearly a trap, a cruel deception meant to lure us into a vulnerable position for a final decisive strike. Others argued we had no choice but to trust the warning, given the deteriorating condition of the station around us. In the end, most personnel chose to evacuate, myself included, and true to the voice's word, we reached the shuttles without encountering any further hostile action. The station itself was lost completely within the hour, its core systems collapsing under damage that would take Council engineers weeks to fully understand once salvage teams eventually returned. But it was not the material loss itself that shook the fleet so deeply. It was the manner of the attack, the patience behind it, and most unsettling of all, the calm mercy shown afterward, a mercy that felt less like compassion and more like a demonstration of total, effortless control over the situation. I sat aboard the evacuation shuttle in silence during the return journey to the Meridian Wake, turning over one particular detail that had been troubling me since Clara's broadcast. She had not needed to warn us at all. Her team could easily have destroyed the station with everyone still aboard, and no rule of engagement would have obligated her otherwise, given the circumstances of active combat. And yet she had chosen to give that warning anyway, calmly, almost casually, as though the outcome of our survival or destruction mattered little to her either way, because her side was so completely confident in the eventual outcome of this war that such gestures cost them nothing. News of the anchor's loss spread quickly through the wider fleet, and its effect on morale was immediate and severe. Within days, quiet conversations began circulating among officers from allied species who had joined the invasion coalition, conversations that Admiral Kion's staff worked hard to suppress but could not fully contain. Several of these allied delegations began requesting private meetings with Council Command, meetings that everyone present understood were really about finding a path toward quiet withdrawal from the campaign before their own forces suffered similar losses. I attended one such meeting as an observer, watching a delegation from a species called the Threll, longtime Council allies who had contributed a significant portion of ground forces to the invasion, present their concerns directly to Admiral Kion. Their lead representative spoke carefully, diplomatically, but the underlying message was impossible to miss. They no longer believed this campaign could be won through the strategies currently being employed, and they were increasingly unwilling to continue sacrificing their own soldiers in support of an approach that seemed to be making the enemy stronger with every passing week, rather than weaker. Admiral Kion attempted to reassure them, citing renewed strategic plans and promises of adjusted tactics, but I could see in the eyes of the Threll representative a doubt that no amount of reassurance was going to fully erase. Trust, once broken by repeated failure, does not rebuild easily, and this campaign had broken trust in ways that ran far deeper than any single battlefield loss could explain. It was during this same difficult period that I experienced something personally that reshaped my entire understanding of the conflict, something I have never fully been able to explain to colleagues who did not witness it themselves. A ceasefire request, unusual and unexpected, arrived through diplomatic channels roughly 2 weeks after the anchor's loss, proposing a brief, formal meeting between Council representatives and a designated human negotiator to discuss the possibility of de-escalation. I was selected, given my analytical background, to accompany the small delegation sent to meet this representative at a neutral location on the planet's surface, a quiet coastal area that had seen no direct fighting throughout the campaign. I remember feeling a strange mixture of professional curiosity and genuine fear as our shuttle descended, uncertain what kind of individual would be chosen to represent an entire species in negotiations with the very forces trying to conquer their world. The man who met us was not what I expected. He introduced himself simply as Peter, dressed in plain civilian clothing rather than any kind of official uniform, and he greeted our delegation with a calm, almost friendly demeanor that felt deeply at odds with the devastation his people had inflicted upon our forces over the preceding weeks. We spoke for nearly 2 hours that afternoon, and much of what he said has stayed with me ever since. He explained, patiently and without any trace of anger or hostility, that his people had never wanted this conflict, that they had spent their entire history hoping the wider universe might offer something better than the endless competition they had known among themselves. But he also explained, with the same calm patience, that hope had never once stopped his people from preparing for the possibility of exactly this kind of confrontation, because history had taught them, again and again, that unpreparedness was the only true guarantee of eventual destruction. I asked him directly what it would take for his people to accept a genuine, lasting peace with the Council, hoping desperately that some reasonable answer existed, some path forward that did not end in further loss on both sides. His answer has remained with me every day since that conversation. He said his people would accept peace the moment it was offered honestly, not as a demand backed by threats, but as an agreement between equals who respected one another's right to exist freely. He said the war we had brought to his world had already taught his people everything they needed to know about our capabilities, our tactics, and our willingness to use overwhelming force against those we considered beneath us. And he said, with a calm certainty that chilled me more than any threat could have, that his people would now spend every remaining year of their existence making absolutely certain they were never caught unprepared by anyone again, whether that meant us or whoever might come after us with similar intentions. I returned to the fleet that evening carrying a report that Admiral Kion read in complete silence, understanding, I believe for the first time with total clarity, exactly what our invasion had actually accomplished. We had not conquered a weak, primitive world ready for easy resource extraction. We had confirmed, through direct and costly experience, every capability and every determination that a species with humanity's particular history was always going to demonstrate once genuinely threatened. And in doing so, we had ensured that this determination, once merely theoretical and confined to their own small world, would now be turned permanently outward, toward the wider universe that had so carelessly decided their home was simply available for the taking. The formal withdrawal began 6 weeks after our arrival in the Sol system, though nobody in the Council fleet ever used the word withdrawal in any official communication. The term chosen instead was reassessment, a carefully worded phrase meant to preserve some measure of dignity for a campaign that had failed in ways nobody at the original vote could have imagined possible. I was present in the command chamber aboard the Meridian Wake when Admiral Kion issued the final order for our forces to begin the slow, careful process of disengagement. The mood among the senior staff was subdued in a way I had never witnessed before, none of the anger or frustration one might expect from a defeated military force, but something closer to quiet, exhausted relief mixed with a deep, unspoken understanding that we were leaving behind a problem that would not simply disappear once our ships departed the system. The process itself took nearly 2 additional weeks to complete properly. Our remaining ground forces needed to be extracted carefully, given how thoroughly human resistance had embedded itself into every region we still nominally occupied. Several extraction attempts required negotiated safe passage, arrangements handled not through Council diplomatic channels but through direct communication with local human commanders, who, despite months of brutal conflict, honored every agreement precisely as stated. This consistency struck me as strange at first, given how ruthlessly effective their combat tactics had been throughout the campaign, until I came to understand that honoring a stated agreement was simply another form of the same discipline that had made their resistance so formidable in the first place. They did not need to break promises to win. They had already won through patience and preparation alone. I spent much of this final period compiling the comprehensive report that Council leadership would eventually receive regarding the entire Earth campaign, a document that took considerably longer to write than any previous assessment I had produced in my career. I wanted every detail recorded accurately, not to assign blame to any particular officer or strategist, but because I genuinely believed the wider Council needed to understand exactly what had happened here, lest some future generation make the same catastrophic miscalculation with consequences even more severe than what we had already experienced. In my report, I laid out the fundamental error that had doomed the campaign from its earliest planning stages. The Council had assessed Earth using metrics designed for evaluating conventional threats, measuring technological capability, fleet strength, and industrial output as though these numbers alone determined a species' capacity for resistance. What our assessment had failed to properly account for was something far less quantifiable but infinitely more decisive, a cultural and historical disposition toward endurance that no amount of technological superiority could easily overcome. I explained, as clearly as I could manage, that humanity's entire recorded history represented an unbroken chain of conflict and adaptation, generation after generation refining tactics of patience, deception, resourcefulness, and sheer stubborn refusal to accept defeat as a permanent condition. This was not a temporary wartime adaptation forced upon them by our invasion. This was simply who they had always been, shaped by millions of years of struggle long before we ever arrived to give them a new kind of enemy to test themselves against. I also included, though I knew it would be uncomfortable reading for Council leadership, a detailed account of exactly how badly our own doctrine had been exploited throughout the campaign. Our rules of honorable engagement, our protocols for accepting surrender, our proportional response calibrations, Every single element of Council military tradition that had served us well against dozens of previous adversaries had become, in this particular conflict, simply another set of exploitable weaknesses for an enemy who had never operated under any similar constraints themselves. The report concluded with a recommendation that I suspected many senior officials would find difficult to accept, though I believed it represented the only honest path forward. I recommended that the Council formally abandon any future plans regarding Earth, not merely as a tactical retreat to be revisited later with improved strategies, but as a permanent recognition that this particular species represented a fundamentally different category of challenge than anything our doctrine had previously encountered. I warned that any future attempt, regardless of how much additional force might be assembled, would likely produce the same result, simply delayed and made more costly by humanity's continued adaptation and growing familiarity with our capabilities. Admiral Kion read my full report personally, before it was ever submitted to wider Council review, and I remember the conversation we had afterward with unusual clarity. He asked me, quietly, whether I believed humanity would eventually seek retaliation against the Council for what we had attempted to do to their world. I told him I did not know for certain, but that based on everything I had witnessed and studied throughout the campaign, I believed retaliation was less important to them than simple, permanent preparation. Humanity did not seem driven by a desire for revenge in the way other species might understand that concept. What drove them instead was a deep, almost instinctual commitment to never again being caught unprepared by any threat, whether that threat originated from within their own world or from somewhere among the stars. Our fleet departed the Sol system quietly, without any formal ceremony or acknowledgement of what had transpired, slipping away in the same manner a wounded animal might retreat from a confrontation it had badly misjudged. I remained aboard the Meridian Wake during the long journey back toward Council space, spending much of that time reflecting on everything I had witnessed, everything I had learned, and everything I still did not fully understand about the species we had so carelessly decided to invade. Months later, once I had returned to Council territory and resumed my duties within the Xeno Assessment Corps, I received an unexpected piece of information through long-range monitoring stations still quietly observing activity within the Sol system from a respectful distance. Human broadcasts, the same kind of transmissions our fleet had once dismissed as harmless entertainment, now carried a noticeably different character than before our invasion. Scientific and educational programming had expanded dramatically, much of it focused on advanced physics, materials science, and engineering concepts that seemed directly inspired by the recovered technology left behind during our hasty withdrawal. I also learned, through careful analysis of these broadcasts, that humanity had begun a coordinated, planet-wide effort toward developing their own capacity for space travel at a pace that our engineers found almost impossible to believe, given the technological gap that had existed only months earlier. Salvaged equipment from destroyed Council vessels, carefully studied and reverse-engineered by human scientists working with a shared sense of urgency, was already providing the foundation for advancements that would likely have taken them decades to achieve through natural progression alone. Perhaps most telling of all was a single broadcast that our monitoring stations intercepted nearly a year after our departure, one that I requested permission to review personally given my role in the original campaign. It showed a public gathering in one of humanity's major cities, crowds celebrating what appeared to be some kind of anniversary related to their successful defense of the planet. Among the speeches and celebrations, one particular address caught my attention more than any other, delivered by a woman named Nora, who identified herself simply as a representative of the reconstruction effort still ongoing across several regions damaged during the conflict. She spoke about resilience, about the cost her people had paid defending their home, and about the lessons they intended to carry forward from this experience. But near the end of her address, she said something directly to any future observers who might be listening from beyond their world, something that I have carried with me every day since first hearing it. She said her people held no particular anger toward the Council for what had been attempted against them. She said conflict and struggle had always been part of their history, and this simply represented another chapter in that same long story. But she said her people would also never forget what they had learned during those difficult weeks, and that anyone considering a similar approach in the future, whether council or otherwise, should understand clearly what they would be choosing to face. She closed her address with a simple, quiet statement that I have never been able to fully shake from my memory since that day. She said the door to peaceful cooperation remained genuinely open to anyone willing to approach honestly and respectfully, but she said that door had also been tested once already, and her people now understood exactly how to answer anyone who mistook that open door for an invitation to walk through it uninvited. I submitted my final analysis to the council shortly after reviewing that broadcast, recommending continued careful observation of Earth's development without any further consideration of military engagement for the foreseeable future. My recommendation was accepted, quietly and without much discussion, by a council leadership still clearly uncomfortable acknowledging exactly how badly the entire campaign had been miscalculated from its earliest planning stages. I still think often about that small blue planet, spinning quietly in its distant corner of the galaxy, home to a species that had spent its entire existence being tested, refined, and shaped by struggle after struggle, long before any of us ever arrived to give them one final, unexpected challenge. We had approved an invasion believing we understood exactly what we were facing. Humanity answered that invasion, calmly and completely, with a level of quiet, patient determination that our doctrine had never once prepared us to properly understand. The Council did not conquer Earth. We did not even come close. What we actually accomplished, through our own arrogance and carelessness, was something far more consequential for the wider galaxy in the years that would inevitably follow. We woke something ancient and formidable from a long, quiet slumber, something that had always been there, patiently waiting, refined by millions of years of struggle into exactly the kind of adversary no invading force should ever wish to encounter. And as I write these final words for the historical record, watching new reports quietly filter in about humanity's continued rapid advancement across every measurable category we once used to judge them as harmless, I find myself returning to the same simple, uncomfortable truth that has followed me since that first difficult conversation with Peter on a quiet coastal shore. We knocked on a door we never should have approached, and whatever eventually comes through it, in whatever direction it eventually travels, will always trace its beginning back to the moment the Council approved an invasion that humanity answered, calmly and completely, with pure terror.